What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds since the 1st of June 2025, going all the way up to the 1st of June 2026. And in today's video, we're going to be going through how I build systems that outlive my current self. We're going to be going through the core premise, my core thinking, how I'm actively approaching this, and how this system ultimately flows through the future you design loop, and how that ultimately feeds into the outcome that comes as a result of this process. So if we go straight into the core premise, we can see that most people build systems for today's problem, and I build for tomorrow's for my version of me tomorrow, and I build for tomorrow's self. And today's version of me is still inside the chaos. And future me has distance, perspective, and leverage. And this is one of the most important points to also mention, that the future version of myself ultimately has distance in terms of where I'm at today versus where I'm at in the future, and perspective on different things that I may see today and have also created leverage through that. And that is one of the core principles or premise that ultimately builds the foundation for this. Solely just understanding that, the version of me today is still inside the chaos, but the version of myself tomorrow is the one that is outside the chaos, that it ultimate and also has perspective and also creates leverage as well. And this is also just, feeding into how I ultimately design my systems as if I've already scaled. And the reason for this is ultimately, thinking in terms of, the teams already exist, workflows already multiply, and chaos is already solved. Because I believe that this ultimately forces me to build cleaner, faster, and smarter. And the cleaner I am to ultimately build what it is that we're building, then I ultimately, have this perspective that allows me to push and force myself to say, hey, I want to make sure that each and every single day we're moving the needle forward and making sure that we're getting things done. And that ultimately forms the premise for the core thinking, for my frame of thinking, which ultimately results in understanding that each system needs to have two purposes. One is to solve the now, ultimately being able to solve the current issue that is at hand. So, what are we solving today in this current present moment in time, and also to prevent resolving it later. And I cannot tell you how many times I've had to resolve things later simply because it hasn't been done in a structured way, simply through solving it now, such so that it doesn't have to be resolved later. For example, let's say you pick a tech stack for your business, and you realize after a certain level of scale that you have to rebuild everything. So that's basically you having to resolve the problems that you are having, when you could have just taken the approach of mapping out the systems that ultimately that you need for this present moment in time, and how you're also going to integrate that when you start reaching a new level of scale. And understanding that you're not just solving for today, but you're also making sure that you're not resolving it later, because that ultimately diminishes your time and the leverage that you could be creating, and you're spending your energy as well in areas that you could that could be better spent in other avenues. And that means that's the trap of most builders, falling into building for convenience and not continuity or durability. And I think this is one of the also important things that I have been super deep on in terms of building for continuity slash durability. How long is what you're building going to last? And tying that up with one of the videos that I've made of having an expiry date, where you constantly reinvent the things that you're building, such so that you don't get lost in entropy. So understanding that each and every single thing that we're building, we're making sure that we're building it once, such so that we don't have to resolve for it later, but only we have to reinvent, in the sense that we're building on top of that, but also inventing something that ultimately scales as a result of the foundation. But that ultimately means from my perspective, I've seen a lot of builders form or built for convenience rather than continuity, and this continuity after a certain level of scale ultimately breaks, and you don't want that to happen where you build something or you have this tech stack that ultimately works from 0 to 100, but then you realize 100 to 1 million ultimately does not work. It ultimately does not serve the purposes that you first built this tech stack for, simply because the process was not done in the manner that it should have been done in terms of thinking through how you ultimately build these systems to ultimately outlive what it is that you're doing today, such so that you don't have to resolve for it into the future. But that ultimately means that when I'm building, I name my automations like I'm handing them off. Ultimately, naming them such so that if someone were to come in, they ultimately understand and have that level of clarity to start getting at it straight away. They don't have to ask questions to say, hey, how do you get this, how do you get this, why is this labeled this, how do you find that. It's all about making sure that I name the specific automations or the things that we're building as if I am handing them off. And that means I document like someone else will maintain it as well. Simply through documentation, a lot of clarity and context is formed for the person that is ultimately, wanting to understand what it is that you're doing. And that is super key to give that context and clarity, because that context and clarity ultimately makes sure that what it is that you've built, you don't have to rebuild it again into the future simply due to, a lack of clarity or a lack of direction. It's ultimately making sure that when I document, I make it in a manner that ultimately makes sure that I'm thinking of it that someone else will maintain it, such so that they have the context to get at it straight away. And that means I design as if it will scale 10x next month, ultimately saying, hey, what are the break points, where can this thing fail, where can this system ultimately fail in the next 10x, if we 10x, sorry, where can it ultimately break. And understanding that through that mindset of saying, hey, I'm going to build this system such so that if we experience 10x growth tomorrow, that we can ultimately handle that, and not say, hey, I'm just going to build this, and if we experience 10x growth tomorrow, then we don't know what to do, we don't have a solid foundation. And I know that through this approach, I know that one day it will matter, it will ultimately reach a level of scale that will ultimately allow us to fully understand this breakpoint that we've ultimately catered for and also thought about, needs to also be taken into our documentation process as well. And that means also we need to understand how the system ultimately works. The future you design loop ultimately functions as this. It starts from mapping out the workflow that you use today. So what is the current workflow that you're ultimately using? And from that, you ultimately, add layers that ultimately play into the future that you will need. So this can be anything from visibility, redundancy, and modularity. So modularity basically meaning that you can swap, different parts out and ultimately still be able to run, rather than, having a tool that ultimately is not compatible with another one. And that is also key, because if you're just building for today, then you're not going to build for tomorrow. And also you're not going to be able to have that level of, hey, we can just swap this specific part out and have another one. And that ultimately is key, because I've seen it countless times where you build this rigid system that it only functions in one specific way, but then when you reach a certain level of scale, complexity increases and people come in and they simply just don't know what to do. It's all about making sure that there's visibility, redundancy, so if it fails you're ultimately able to have backups, and also modularity, so can you swap different components or different parts from this system, and also just make sure that it still runs. And that also now feeds into how you're then able to then remove every unnecessary decision. Basically, ODCAM, my personal framework that I like to use this for. So basically, having the objectives and then decisions and then clarity, then actionable steps that you need to ultimately take, and then having measurements, or just basically being able to measure and track that, and understanding, removing all the decisions that ultimately do not allow you to then refine your system, ultimately means that this also feeds into the build once and iterate forever. So that means that you're only building once and you're iterating on it forever, so that you have a solid foundation, such so that it's not so rigid that you cannot move swapping parts, or you cannot swap parts, but you can also just ultimately refine on this current stack that you have, and also making sure that you're building this system in a manner that ultimately outlives how you're working today, but also how you're going to be into the future, and just constantly refining this machine and asking, hey, will this survive 10 years from now? Will it not? Or if it were to experience 10x growth next month, could it still, function in the same manner? And also understanding where the different breakpoints as well, which is also super key in terms of, so that you can also map out different strategies, mitigation strategies that you'd also need to have as well. And that ultimately allows you to then have this loop where you map every workflow, and then from that you add layers that will ultimately play into the future growth scale, and from there you remove every unnecessary decision, and that ultimately allows you to build once and iterate forever, and not constantly having to build over on top of it, because that will ultimately increase complexity. And when complexity increases, when you have someone coming in, even context sometimes can be somewhat of a hurdle. So it's just reducing that context barrier, that if someone were to come in today, they simply solely just understand, hey, this is how we've been building the machine, and this is how we're going to continue building it as well. And that ultimately means that the outcome for this is that you're building for future, you're ultimately building for future you that creates time arbitrage. You're then able to leverage your time and make sure that you're focusing on the high level tasks that ultimately produce the results that you ultimately want from the system. And that means you pay for the cost of thinking now in order to collect the dividends later. It's somewhat of a longer term play, where you're paying for the cost of thinking now in terms of you're going to get it into the future. And that ultimately plays into if you're building this for 10x growth into the future, and rather taking a longer time period view on what it is that you're building. And that also means that you're not optimizing your day, but architecting your decade. Most businesses, at least from my perspective, ultimately, somewhat to some degree, architect their decade, and they are ultimately able to outlast and be durable through different phases and times. And that ultimately allows you to have this approach that feeds into your competitive advantage mode, that ultimately drives your level of scale and also the level of impact that you will have into the future. And this is just somewhat of how I'm actively thinking about this in terms of the design loop, and how I view it as well, which I think is super valuable, and ultimately allows you to build systems that ultimately outlive your current self, but also make sure that into the future you're not just rebuilding everything, because complexity increases, like I mentioned, and you don't want to be in a place where you're constantly having to rebuild simply because the foundation was not solidly built. And this is one of the things that I think is also super important, in terms of if you're just looking at a longer time period and saying, hey, in the next 10 years we ultimately still want to function, we still want to have the competitive modes that ultimately allows us to stay at the top. And that ultimately in my perspective, somewhat gives you that leverage that you can use. And if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to check out my newsletter. It's the first link in the description. And also if you want to connect with me, you can just check out the links to my X, LinkedIn, Instagram. They're just below that. And I will see you guys in the next video.